Okay, today's daf we're going to learn is Nedarim Daf Ayin Gimel. Today's daf is sponsored by Katriella Friedman in memory of her mother, Gerda Stein, Frida Bat Fruma, on her 50th site. Her dedication to scholarship and knowledge has been my inspiration. Okay, we're going to get started with continuation of our Gemara. We had yesterday a question of Rami Bar Chama, which was Ba'al ma'u she'afer below shmi'ah. When the Torah says Vishama Isha, maybe the topic is certainly the beginning of today's shiur is how literally do we take the words in the Torah? The Torah said Vishama Isha, her husband has to hear. So now the question is, does he actually have to hear? Or is the Torah just describing an average situation where the husband hears the vows and then decides I'm going to nullify them? So Rami Bar Chama now asks, if you remember yesterday, we did not, right? The theme of yesterday was no answers to any questions. We did not conclude. However, Rami Bar Chama continues his questioning kind of based on if we say that he doesn't have to hear, then here comes another question. Someone who's deaf, and here we're talking presumably about someone who's only deaf but not a mute. Often remember, cheresh means a deaf mute, who's generally considered a person who doesn't have da'at, doesn't have proper knowledge or intellectual capabilities, and because of that, can't do all sorts of things. So presumably we're not talking about someone like that because clearly they wouldn't really be able to nullify the vows of their wife. But here, what if someone's just deaf? And another reason, by the way, it probably isn't a deaf mute is because they say that you have to express it in words. And if you can't say it, the nullification, then it's not a valid nullification. So, someone who's just deaf, but can speak, is he allowed to nullify his wife's vows? So now here comes the explanation of the question. If we were to answer the previous question as Baal mefer below shmi'ah, a husband can nullify the vow without actually hearing it. So, right, what would you think? So maybe if you're deaf and you don't hear, maybe it doesn't matter because anyway, the husband doesn't need to hear. However, so then why is it even a question? Well, mishum de bar mishmahu. Maybe a husband who's not deaf at least can potentially hear. And therefore, even if he doesn't hear, it's a valid nullification. However, someone who can't even potentially hear, maybe he wouldn't count for doing nullification. Now, why is this? Okay, aval cheresh, let's just read it inside. De la bar mishmu, since he can't potentially hear, right? In other words, there's a difference between not hearing what she said because you weren't in the room and you just never found out, versus you never could have heard because your hearing doesn't function properly. So, if that's the case, now why is this an issue? Hainu de Rabbi Zera. This is Rabbi Zera. Now, to Amar Rabbi Zera, kol ha'ra'oi lebila ein bila ma'akevet bo. Kol she'ein ha'ra'oi lebila bila ma'akevet bo. This is something that comes up many, many times. Seen it before, but if you're new and you don't remember, we'll review it all again. This comes from the Torah. The Torah talks about korban mincha. The main sugi here is the menacha, which we haven't seen yet. The Torah says you need the mincha, the meal offering that goes along with the sacrifices, is bilula bashemen. It's solet, it's fine flour, mixed with oil. Now, because the Torah doesn't command us to mix it with oil, but describes it as a dough, a flour that's mixed with oil, it's a descriptor. So the question is, what if it's actually not mixed? So Rabbi Zera says, even if it's not mixed, it's fine. You can use this as a mincha offering if it's not properly mixed. However, it has to have the potential to be mixed. Now, what does it mean to have the potential to be mixed? Flour and oil kind of always have the potential to be mixed. Well, I don't know if this ever happened to you, but you try to put a dough in a bowl that's too small, what happens? Everything starts falling out. So therefore, you're not allowed to put the mincha, if the mincha is made of 60 esronim, which is approximately 150 liters, mixed with 1 log of shemen, which is approximately 350 milliliters. That amount is the amount that fits into, whatever their average bowl was. Obviously, in our day, we have mixing bowls of all different sizes and shapes. But in those days, maybe there were, or in the Beit HaMikdash particularly we're talking about, there was a kli that held exactly that amount. In other words, that was the amount it would hold without everything spilling over. So as soon as you have a mincha offering that's larger than that, according to Rabbi Zera, then that's how Rabbi Zera explains, it needs to be split into 2 bowls, because at that point you couldn't actually mix it because everything would start falling out of the bowl. So that's a concept that comes up in all sorts of areas of halacha. The most relevant to women is going to the mikvah. Okay, if you have an ear infection or something in your ear that you can't go to the mikvah. So what do? You put something in your ear, but it would have to be something like a cotton ball, where if you stayed in the water long enough, the water could actually penetrate. That's called ra'oi lebila. It's theoretically it could get in, even though it's not going to get in right now. Obviously, do it in a way that really the water can't get. That you have to find the right balance between protecting your ear and also having it that potentially you could do it. So therefore, says Rami Bar Chama, or asks Rami Bar Chama, when Rabbi Zera says this principle, does this principle apply also in this case? That when it says V'shamai Isha, again, is it right? Even if you say that he doesn't really need to hear, the question is, does he not need to hear at all? And does it have nothing to do with hearing? And it's really just describing, a potential situation? Or does it mean even if he didn't hear, as long as he potentially could have heard? So that's his question. Oh, Dilma, here's the second side. V'shamai isha lo ma'akev. Or no, hearing has nothing really to do with this. It really doesn't matter. So Amar Rava Tashma, Rava is going to prove it from the following source. V'shama isha, okay, this is the drasha on that pasuk, and her husband hears. Prat la'eshet cheresh. This comes to exclude the wife of someone who's deaf. Meaning the answer is clear. A deaf person is not actually allowed to nullify his wife's vows, which means, by the way, that if she's betrothed and he can't do it, the father can't do it either, because you need both of them. And therefore, that can't be. And notice what it says here, right? So it's clear that the Eshet Cheresh is on the outs, Shma Mina. Okay, from here, you at least get an answer to the second question. Now, I say this because Tosfot quotes Rashi as saying, this actually answers the first question as well. Okay, why? I'm going to read in Tosfot for a minute. Okay, and the words, it's very small, but it says on the side Tosfot, Prat la'eshet cheresh, it's in the small print on the left. Perish HaKantrus, which is Rashi, midelo mema'et el cheresh. Notice this drasha only excluded the wife of a deaf person, which sounds like mashma da'af agav delo shama. It sounds like a regular husband who just didn't hear would be okay because it's not excluded from this braita, which raises a very important question that Tosfot raises, which is, well, if that's the case, then why did they use this braita to answer Rami Bar Chama's question on yesterday's daf, right? If this answers that question, it should have been there. Despite the fact that Tosfot answers the question, Tosfot really agrees with Rashi that at the end, we get to a conclusion, even though there wasn't a conclusion about Rami Bar Chama. And I want to teach this section right now, this debate about how to read this, because I want to teach you a little bit, we have some time today, a little bit of methodology about how to paskin from the Gemara. We had a question that was open-ended. It didn't have any answers. But from the end of the sugya, remember, the sugya went, does the husband need to hear or does he not need to hear? And then we said, if he doesn't need to hear, does he at least need to have the potential to hear, which would then exclude a deaf person? And the answer was that deaf person's excluded. But from the fact that we exclude the deaf person, and we don't exclude in this drasha, in the braita, anything else. Remember, this is an earlier source. We didn't exclude anything else. It sounds like he actually doesn't need to hear. So Tosfot says, even though it's really odd, why didn't the Gemara say this earlier in answer to the first question? Still, we can conclude from this braita that we have an answer to the first question as well, which means husband doesn't hear, he can still nullify her vows. So the Ran quotes the Ramban as saying, you can't learn it from here, basically. Okay, and he says, let's see what part I want to read. Right, he basically flips Tosfot and says, no. He says, because the Gemara didn't use this before, the Tosfot is in Dibur Matchil, the Tosfot is the Dibur Matchil Prat Le'eshet Cheresh. Okay, it's about right in the center of Tosfot on the page. And the Ran is on Abaye Rami Bar Chama, Mishum Debar Mishmahu. On those words, a few lines down, he quotes V'katav Ramban, Didavka Cheresh Mishum Dela Bar Shmi'ah. Okay, only the Cheresh, Aval Inish Ta'alma Debar Shmi'ah, who But then he says, but since you could have answered this question, the Ramban has an issue that basically I don't understand why the Gemara didn't bring it earlier. And because of that, he kind of raises it as that's a problem if it really was answering that question. However, at the end, the Ran says, I'll give you a different reason why we paskin like this. Okay, we could still paskin. The husband doesn't have to hear her vows in order to nullify, not because of this breita, because again, this breita should have answered it right there. This breita obviously isn't a clear enough proof for that. However, he says the following, based on the Rambam, and he quotes it, the last words of the Ran here are, V'chein dad harambam zal. The Rambam holds, and this is very interesting when you're learning Gemara, because he says, anytime you have this imtim tzaloma structure, where basically the Gemara starts off with two options, could be this, it could be that, and then it goes into one of the options and says, and if you want to say this, then I'm going to ask that. And if you want to say this, I want to ask that, right? You imagine just a flow chart and it goes this way. And since the Gemara keeps going in that direction and ignores the other direction, it shows the Rambam believes that we hold by that opinion. So even though maybe in the end you're left with some other question, in our case, you actually aren't because we actually answered the last question, but let's say you end with a question, everything where it said, if you want to say this, then I'll ask this. If the if part, the first part is actually we hold that way. And therefore the Ran rules in the end that you don't need to hear based on the fact that the Gemara asked a question within that option, okay, or Rami Bar Chama himself, right? So the second question was premised on answering the first question in a particular manner. That already shows we hold that way, which is fascinating. Not everybody agrees with this, but the Rambam does, and here the Ran holds like him. Okay, next question. Okay, similar. This is a similar type of question. The question earlier was when the Torah says V'shama isha, our husband hears, do we have to take that literally? Here also we're going to say, do we have to take something literally? So we'll see in a minute. Of husband, could he nullify in the same statement two wives' vows? Can he say, I'm nullifying both your vows? Or likewise, a father, can he nullify two daughters' vows at the same time? Ota dafka, olav dafka, when it says in the Torah, V'im biyom shamoa isha, when the husband hears, yani ota. I noticed in Safaria, the translation of yani is he restrains her. Okay, he's trying to restrain her from making this vow. Veheferet nidra asher aleha. So notice what it says, yani ota. He restrains her. That means he's basically being made for one wives at a time, it sounds like, because it's singular. So again, ota dafka, olav dafka. Well, I mean, normally it's going to be one. So if it happens to be two, maybe it could work. Maybe the Torah is just giving the typical case. But if there was a unique case where he was doing two at one, maybe it would work. Amar Ravina Tashma, this time Ravina, who brings a proof, he says, let's learn it from here. Ein mashkin shtei sotot ke'echad. Now we're moving topics in order to get to an answer. If you have two wives, a man has two wives who he accuses of being a sota, and he wants to basically, right, it's just easier, I'm already on my way to the temple, let me just do this all in both in one shot. And right, you got to wonder, maybe the husband's got an issue if he's suspicious of both his wives. Anyway, he comes to the temple and he wants to do it both at the same time. Halacha is no way, no how. You cannot do two wives at one time. Why? The background to this before I explain it is, right, the translation I saw, the kohen had a good translation for this word liba gas. One is emboldened in front of the other. Okay, so now, what does this mean? The goal, and we're going to see when we get to Sota, which is we're not so far away from at this point, the goal in Sota really is to prevent the Sota ceremony from happening. We don't really ever want to get there. Why? Well, one of the reasons, besides all the humiliation and how horrible it is for the woman, in addition, one of the things they do, we talked about this recently, is they erase God's name. Now, erasing God's name, right, we don't want to do that if we can avoid that. So they do everything they can to get the woman, what's going to prevent the ceremony? The woman will admit that, right? Or the husband will drop the charges. So we want the woman to admit that she did it. So if there's two wives and maybe one did it, one didn't, and one says, Torani, which means I'm good, I'm pure, I didn't do anything. The other one, we already know from Yevamot and from the fact that they're called two wives, are called Sarah, rival wives, as they translate them. And there's already rivalry between them. If one says I'm innocent, the other one is going to have a hard time admitting in front of the other one that, oh, but I'm guilty, very unlikely she'll do that. That's what it means, libagas bechaverta. Okay, so far this has absolutely nothing to do with this, if you haven't noticed. Rabbi Yehuda Omer, lo min Hashem muzeh. Rabbi Yehuda disagrees with Tanakam. He says, that's not the reason. I agree with you that man can't bring two sota wives to the temple at the same time, but not for the reason you said, because we're worried she's not going to admit it in front of the other. Ela mishum shene'emar v'hishka. Hishka with a dot in the hay, a mapik, which means he waters, meaning he makes her drink. He makes her drink in singular form. It's just like ota. Now we have the connection, right? Ota levada, just he by herself. So just like there, we take it literally when it says he brings her to the temple, her in singular form, and not both of them to the temple. Therefore, by us also, yani ota means only her. This is probably one of those examples, right? There's always a question with drashot. What came first, the chicken or the egg, right? The halacha or the drasha, or the drasha or the halacha? Did they really get the halacha from the drasha? Or did they know the halacha and just tried to connect it to the pasuk? This looks more like they knew the drasha and tried to connect it to the pasuk, because what you would have expected the Torah to talk about two wives, then it would have been very confusing. What if I only have one wife, and it would be, that would be strange. Anyway, but that's the drasha, and that's where they learn in the end that, okay, so now it's interesting, because if you go with the Ran and Tosfot that we rule on the first question, the vishama is not shama isha. Again, it means somewhat literally, somewhat not literally. Shama isha means he has to at least potentially hear. He doesn't have to actually hear. But ota, we take 100% literally, only her and not anyone else. So those were our two questions, which really derived from wording in the Torah. Do we take them literally? How literally do we take them, etc.? New Mishna, Amud Bet. Bogeret, sheshata 12 chodesh. Okay, bogeret, I'm going to translate this literally, and then I'm going to translate it the way the Gemara translated it a few tapim ago on Daf Ayin, but it sounds like it's saying a bogeret, one who came of age, right? 12 months, 2 hairs, and 12 years, 2 pubic hairs, and then 6 months. Now she's a bogeret, or if you remember, the Gemara said not the bogeret that waited 12 months after being betrothed, but a bogeret and one sheshata 12 chodesh. So a bogeret who kind of, right, at that point, she's out of her father's domain, and a woman sheshata 12 chodesh, and a woman who is betrothed and already waited the 12 months, which at that point, the husband's supposed to marry her already and starts paying her food. V'almana 30 yom, for a widow, it's only 30 days to prepare the wedding. Rabbi Eliezer because Rabbi Eliezer says the husband's already obligated to pay her sustenance, and therefore he also can nullify her vows. The rabbis say no. Unless they're married, he doesn't have rights. Again, what we mean here is exclusive rights without the father. He doesn't have exclusive rights without the father until he actually marries her. Amar Rabba. So Rabba comes in now and says, and basically we're going to deal with Rabba for the rest of today. Rabbi Eliezer u'Mishna Rishona amru davar echad. He takes two different things, our Mishnah and a different Mishnah, which we call the early Mishnah, because the Mishnah is going to say there, it's a Mishnah Ketubot that we already learned. It's going to say earlier they thought this, and then they changed it. So we basically want to say that Rabbi Eliezer matches the earlier tradition in the Mishnah. What is that? Ditnan, notnim lebetula yud bet chodesh lefarnes atzma. Okay, the first 12 months she's responsible to support herself, which really means her family usually would support her then. Higia yud bet chodesh, as soon as 12 months comes after the betrothal, and he hasn't yet married her, ochelet mishalo ve'ochelet betruma. Number 1, she eats from his food. He has to support her. Number 2, if he's a kohen, she can already eat truma. Okay, let's go back for a minute and talk about the way truma works. You might remember this, you might not. Saw this a few times in Ketubot. Theoretically, by Torah law, she can already eat truma when she gets betrothed. However, the rabbis, for 2 potentially different reasons, said she can't eat truma. Number 1, either because she's still living in her father's house, and therefore there's a concern that she'll bring home truma food to her house, and her brothers, sisters, parents will eat the truma, and that obviously is a problem. So we want to prevent that situation from happening. So the rabbi said, no truma while you're betrothed. Number 2, maybe he'll find a blemish in her and he won't want to marry her. And then he'll break the engagement. And then, right, to do that, he has to actually give her a divorce. But then it will be that really the only reason when she's betrothed that she can eat truma is because she's going to marry him. But if she doesn't actually marry him, then she really can't eat when she's betrothed. So therefore, we want to avoid it because maybe they won't actually go through with the marriage. This whole thing about they would check her just before the marriage. I'm not going to get back into all that. So now, according to this, okay, before we even continue, because this is the main thing, it's the same thing as our Mishna, because already at that moment, she can eat truma, she can get sustained, and therefore also Rabbi Eliezer says he can nullify her vows. They all seem to go together. That's what Rabbi says. We're going to continue and read the rest of the Mishnah, which is a little less relevant, although we'll get to eventually how they changed it. See the difference between the Mishnah Rishonah, the early Mishnah, and not. But now we get sidetracked with the Yabam. Aval hayabam, but if her husband dies from the betrothal and she's waiting for the Yabam to marry her, eino ma'achil betruma, and he's a kohen just like his brother was a kohen, right? Then she can't eat truma. Here are some examples. Let's say, and that's what they mean here, means you can't continue the count to get to a year. If she was betrothed to the first one and he died after 6 months, and then the Yabam was with her waiting, right? She was waiting for him to marry her for 6 months. And then she says, well, it's 12 months already. No, it doesn't count from the beginning. Okay. What if he divorced her a day before the 12 months was, he died. In this case, right, he dies. I made a mistake, right? It's a Yabam case. He dies. So if he died just under the 12-month mark, or he was betrothed her for 1 day, died, and then the Yabam comes, and she says, look, it's 12 days, even 1 day short, she can't eat truma. You need 12 full months under the Yabam. Zo Mishna Rishona. So this whole thing is the Mishna Rishona. Beit Din shalach areihem, but after that, the court instituted ein ha'isha ochelet betruma ad tikanes lechuppah, which sounds like the rabbi's opinion. So this sounds very parallel. Rabbi seems to make a lot of sense. However, it's not the end of our daf yet, so there must be more. Amar le Abaye. Abaye says, I disagree with your comparison. And Abaye is going to give two perspectives here. One, why we could say that the Mishnah Rishonah wouldn't hold like Rabbi Eliezer. And two, why we would hold that Rabbi Eliezer wouldn't necessarily hold like the Mishnah Rishonah. It's going to have to be different, and you'll see as we go through. So Amar le Abaye. Dilma lohi. Maybe not. Ad kan lo kashma'ina Mishnah Rishonah ela lemecha betruma de Rabbanan. The truma issue is only a rabbinic issue. Remember, the fact that what's rabbinic about it? The fact that she can't eat truma when she's betrothed is only a rabbinic decree. By Torah law, she really could. So that's why when 12 months kicks in, the Mishnah Rishonah says, okay, well, now she could start eating truma because we were only preventing her from eating truma for rabbinic reasons. So therefore, let's already let her eat truma. Aval Nedarim de'oraita imalo. But vows, the fact that he can nullify her vows exclusively is a Torah law. And since they're not actually married yet, maybe not. So therefore, the Mishnah Rishonah wouldn't necessarily hold like Rabbi Eliezer. You could distinguish between the two. And likewise, when Rabbi Eliezer says he can nullify her vows, that might be only as regarding vows, but not regarding truma. Why? Kidirav Pinchas Mishmei Derava. We made mention of this before, but now we're seeing it inside for the first time. Also, it's going to appear in tomorrow's daf. De'amal kol hanoderet al dat ba'ala hinoderet. Why does a husband have rights to nullify the vows of a wife? Here, Pinchas gives a reason in the name of Rava. It's because when a husband normally has financial responsibility for the wife, and therefore, since he's in charge of her financially, which, if you remember, that means, right, her salary goes to him normally, he gives her food. So therefore, she can't ever take a vow, and this goes back to, in certain areas, in nefesh, if it's going to be bad for her, or things that have to do with the two of them, since, right, she's only going to take a vow if her husband agrees. In other words, the idea is not that the husband can come after and nullify the vow. He comes and says that from the beginning, when she takes the vow, she takes it assuming her husband is going to agree to this. And it's almost like it's a condition. Here's my vow under the condition that my husband agreed, even though she doesn't say it. And they even say, what if there's a woman who doesn't care about this? So they say, well, we go by the average woman, and we just have to assume all women do this. And therefore, again, this also is described in a particular society, whereas a patriarchal society makes sense. So therefore, since that's the case, when does that start? When there's financial responsibility. And when does that happen? At 12 months, okay? So now, that's specifically when it comes to vows, though. But truma, but the reasons to not allow her to eat truma are still applicable. Remember, maybe he still won't marry her because they're not married yet. And maybe she'll end up feeding it to her family members because she's still living with her family. So financial responsibility has nothing to do with that. It has everything to do with vows. It has nothing to do with that. Again, everything to do with vows if you hold like Rav Pinchas. Rav Pinchas is not the only way to understand things. But if you hold like Rav Pinchas, then that would make perfect sense. And then basically we'd say the Rabbi Eliezer perhaps holds like Rav Pinchas, which is why he says this about vows, but he wouldn't necessarily say it about truma. So very easy structure for the second part. We had a Mishna about machloket Rabbi Eliezer and the rabbis. Rabbah tried to line up, right? So it's good when you can line things up. Line up Rabbi Eliezer with the Mishna Rishonah and the rabbis with the Mishnah Achrona, which with the change by the later court. And right, this is all these changes were in the time of the Mishnah. And the Abaye rejects it and says, no, the Mishnah Rishonah wouldn't necessarily say what Rabbi Eliezer says. Rabbi Eliezer wouldn't necessarily say what the Mishnah Rishonah said. And with that, we finish for today, starting a new Mishnah, talking about Yibum. We'll get to that in tomorrow's daf. Wishing everyone a Shabbat Shalom.